Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our virtual Enlightenment Salon of February 19th, 2023. I am quite looking forward to this session today. As you can see, we have a large number of illustrious minds gathered here. I am Gennady Stoliarov II, chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, and joining us are our Director of Visual Arts, Art Ramon Garcia, our Vice Chairman, Erin Vahanian, our Director of Scholarship, Dan Elton, our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer, our Biotechnology Advisor and the founder and CEO of Sierra Sciences, Dr. Bill Andrews, our Technology Advisor and Foreign Ambassador in Spain, Dr. Jose Cordero, our friend and member David Wood, who is the founder of London Futurists and Future Surge in the UK, our member and founder and CEO of the Human Achievement Alliance, Dr. Edward Hudgens. In the background, we also have our Director of Energy Issues, John Carrots, and our special guest today, returning for the third time to our virtual Enlightenment Salon, is Dr. Aubrey de Grey. Now, to virtually everybody within the transhumanist and longevity community, Dr. Aubrey de Grey needs no introduction. So I will just mention some of his new titles since the last time we spoke with him in Dublin. And those are President and Chief Science Officer of the LEV Foundation. LEV, of course, stands for Longevity Escape Velocity. And the founding of the LEV Foundation was announced at the Longevity Summit Dublin in September 2022. And since that time, there has been just a phenomenal amount of activity. I have some insight into this because I am a member of the board of directors of the LEV Foundation, as is David Wood. So we know a lot of what has been going on behind the scenes. But today, we are going to highlight the flagship research effort of the LEV Foundation, which is its first robust mouse rejuvenation study. And with that introduction, I would like to give Dr. Aubrey de Grey the opportunity to provide some opening remarks on the robust mouse rejuvenation study, what it seeks to accomplish, and what are some of the innovations that the study introduces in terms of combination treatments and the goals of the study and what it may achieve in terms of public perception. So Aubrey, please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Gennady. It's a real joy to be back here, and I am delighted to be able to describe and to present the study that we are just beginning right now. As you say, it is our flagship study at LEV Foundation, and we've introduced quite a lot of new ideas and innovations, and I'm very proud of what has already been achieved just in the design of the study and getting it to the point of its initiation. But there's a lot to say, and because this is quite a sophisticated audience, I'm going to go into a fair amount of depth about what we're doing. And rather than delivering something with a PowerPoint, the way that one would normally do, I thought that the best backdrop for the description of the study and the discussion of the study would be the webpage that we have at levf.org describing it. Partly because some of you may very well have read that page already, and so you'll be somewhat prepared for what I'm going to say. But secondly, because I want that page to be as good as it can possibly be. And of course, it won't be just one page for very long. There's going to be a lot more out there over the coming months and years. And therefore, I'm going to really, appreciate the feedback that everyone here gives regarding what perhaps we haven't said clearly enough, or haven't said at all, or anything like that. So that's how I'm going to do things. All right. So let me first of all give a little bit of context to this, and this is something that's not actually on the web page in question, so you don't need to start reading anything yet. So, of course, it's been 20 or more years now since I first put forward the idea that repairing the self-inflicted damage that the body does to itself throughout life and that eventually makes us sick late in life would be easier than slowing down the rate at which the body generates that damage in the first place, which was the pre-existing paradigm. And even though it was a big paradigm shift, I'm quite proud that it realistically only took about 1 decade for the mainstream, the expert community to get their heads around it, to understand that actually this was a sensible way of looking at things. That was really cemented and finalized with the publication in 2013 of the famous paper, The Hallmarks of Aging, which was essentially a restatement of what I had written more than a decade earlier, but which was written by very mainstream authoritative people in a very top journal, and which became by a large distance the most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging this century. So, since then, it's been a great relief that I have not had to spend my time justifying the damage repair approach. But a key thing that needs to be understood about the damage repair approach is that it is inherently a divide and conquer approach, because, of course, the body being such a complicated machine generates an enormous number of types of damage during life. And each of those types of damage can, well, at least each of the major ones can kill you on its own, more or less on schedule, however well we fix all the others, which is, a bit of a shame, really, because it means that we have no choice but to actually address out. So this has led me over the past 10 or 15 years to pursue a lot of different projects in parallel. Many of them, of course, within Sense Research Foundation, and before that, even within the Methuselah Foundation. And that's gone pretty well. Even as little as 6 or 8 years ago, I would have had to admit that a couple of the major categories of damage within the damage repair classification that I put forward back in the early 2000s had not seen very much progress, specifically mitochondrial mutations and stiffening of the extracellular matrix. But I'm pleased to say that work that we either did or funded did change that maybe 5 years ago, thereabouts, plus or minus, with the result that now everything's going rather well. Of course, some things are a lot further along than others, no question about that. And there's still plenty of need for work to be accelerated, especially in relation to the hardest, the most difficult areas of damage repair. So it's extremely good that there are still people who appreciate the value of philanthropy in this area and who are not simply going into the low-hanging fruit that has made its way into the private sector. There's plenty that still needs to be done that's pre-investable. But a lot of people often ask me, what is the real difference of emphasis between LEV Foundation and Sense Research Foundation? And honestly, the main difference is that we are focusing at LEV Foundation on things that may never be investable, at least not there's no easy path towards that. In contrast to the situation at Sense, where the business model really, ever since perhaps 2016, 2017 at least, was to spin projects out individually as startup companies as soon as they got to a point of sufficient proof of concept that any of the more courageous angel investors or seed investors were willing to write checks. We probably won't be doing that at LEV Foundation, not in the foreseeable future anyway, because the things that we're doing are just antithetical in a lot of ways to what investors are looking for. And in particular, the flagship research program that I'm going to be spending most of my time on today is very much in that category, because it's all about combining existing therapies. Now, what's wrong with that? What's so hard about that? Well, of course, the difficulty from a private sector position is that some of these therapies may not be investable at all because they're unpatentable or they're off patent. Some of them, may be patented, but different components are patented by different people, and there's all the complications around, cross-licensing and so on. So, it's genuinely quite tricky, and we do not want the progress towards defeating human aging to be slowed down by that. So we believe that this is something where we have to be just completely upfront and say, like, this is something that needs to be funded by philanthropy, and that's what it is being at the moment. So what are we doing that is so innovative? Well, so I've already explained that we're doing combination therapies, but we're not the only people who are doing that. Various people have become interested in the idea that we need to put multiple things together. This has essentially been a corollary of the hallmarks concept. In other words, the idea that aging, that we don't get very far by regarding aging as a unitary phenomenon. It's much better to regard it as a bunch of semi-independent processes proceeding in parallel in the body. I say semi-independent because there's definitely crosstalk between them, but nevertheless, the idea that a divide and conquer approach should be more effective, is more promising than applying single interventions, is one that has very much caught on within the expert community. A second thing that I think is very important, and again is somehow inspired by the idea of damage repair, but is also inspired by the idea that, the people who are likely to provide financing, whether private or public, to such work are people who are already in middle age. That is that we should start in middle age. We should do experiments in the laboratory that are not begun by making transgenic modifications to the ancestors of the mice that we're going to be looking at, or even doing things non-genetically, but starting at, weaning of mice, for example. But rather we should start when the animals we are treating are already, let's say, 2/3 of the way through their natural lifespan. This is something that has, again, been increasingly widely embraced, even though it remains the case that only a small minority of experiments in the laboratory, especially on mice, are done in that way. A large part of the reason why so few experiments are done that way is because they often don't work. In fact, they even more often don't work than when you start early in life. And of course, in academia, it is extremely important to get publications, and publications tend to happen largely when we have positive results. In other words, you actually succeed in, for example, extending the longevity of the mice you're treating. So I'll be moving on to my actual webpage in a moment, but just one thing before I do that, which is that since as I said, these things have become relatively understood over the past couple of years anyway, you may ask, so what makes the LEV Foundation approach unique? And the answer to that, again, comes down to, how much can you do with a certain amount of money, with the maximum likelihood of getting published and so on. And unfortunately, what that has driven everybody except us to do is to restrict themselves to dietary interventions, things that you can do which are only supplied in the stuff that you feed the mice. Now, of course, there are lots of things that you can do that way, that you can mix into the chow that mice eat, but there are lots of things you can't do that way. You can't do cell therapy that way. You can't do gene therapy that way. And that's bad news, because there are lots of things which almost certainly can't be done in terms of damage repair, especially unless you you do things like cell therapy or gene therapy. So we are the only ones who are being, I'm going to say, courageous enough to do that. And when I say courageous, it's you could call it courageous just financially, because the experiment that I'm going to be talking about for the next 10 or 15 minutes is a $3 million experiment. It's it's a lot of mice, 1,000 mice, and we have high hopes for it. But we also know that there is a respectable chance that it will not give good results, or at least not as good as we need in order to achieve the goals of this program, and that we will want to carry on doing repeat versions of it with different component therapies and so on. So yeah, these are expensive experiments, and that's, especially since, as I say, it's being funded by philanthropy, that means that perhaps nobody except LEV Foundation is in a position to bring in the amount of money and to avoid the constraints that have prevented other people from going this way. All right, so now I'm going to actually talk about the study. So thank you very much. Perfect. All right, so on the first, so as I mentioned, this is the webpage, a webpage at lev.f.org, and everything that anyone here has to say by way of suggestions for how to improve this, how to make it more informative, how to improve the wording of things or whatever, this would be extremely appreciated. So, so as I say, large mouse lifespan studies that we're doing and taking various subsets of interventions. One thing that I want to highlight here is how we are choosing the interventions. My view is that, and this is not controversial really, I think this is shared by most experts in the field, is that if you are taking mice and you have something you want to do to them and you find that it increases their average lifespan, but it does not increase their maximum lifespan, the lifespan of the longest lived few mice relative to controls, then you probably are doing something good to a lot of the major things that kill those mice. But you are almost certainly not doing much to all of the things. There must be some things that you are not slowing down, not postponing, that are seriously life-threatening for mice. Whereas if you have an intervention which postpones the average lifespan and also postpones the maximum lifespan by a similar amount, then you're in a very different situation. You're in a situation where you probably are, one way or another, postponing everything that's really bad for the mice, at least everything that kills a lot of mice. And it doesn't necessarily matter whether you understand how you're doing that. I mentioned crosstalk earlier on about how, you've got a lot of different types of damage accumulating all at the same time, and that you have to hit all of them, but that they are only semi-independent. That must not be forgotten. In fact, the magnitude of that crosstalk may be substantially greater than historically gerontologists used to think. So that's worth mentioning. We don't necessarily have to know whether a particular intervention is directly postponing a particular type of age-related pathology, or whether it's doing it indirectly by knock-on mechanisms that we don't necessarily identify yet. Nevertheless, maximum lifespan extension is very important. So what we did was we looked around and said, okay, are there any interventions out there yet that have individually been able to extend mean and maximum lifespan of mice? And we're talking normal mice here, not mice that have something wrong with them so that they have an unusually short lifespan normally, that have extended the mean and maximum lifespan of normal mice when those interventions are initiated in middle age. So when the mice are, let's say, 2/3 of the way through their normal lifespan. That is the absolute gold standard. And we were able to identify 4 interventions that actually succeed, that actually achieve that have been, where work has been published showing that level of benefit. And our goal, therefore, is to put these 4 interventions together and to see whether we get even more benefit. Again, we're going to be doing it in the same way, starting late in life, 19 months of age. And we are going to be looking at various combinations. We're going to be having, obviously, a control group that has none of these interventions done. We're going to have a group that has all 4 of them. We're going to have groups that have each one individually, just so that we have good verification that we're doing the intervention right. And we're also going to have interventions that have 3 out of the 4 in all 4 possible ways. That's because we want to be able to see whether there are any antagonistic interactions between these. This is something that a lot of people are a little concerned about, that there could easily be antagonistic interactions such that the longest lived treatment group in our 10 out of our 10 different groups will not be the one that gets all 4 of the interventions. Instead, it'll be one that gets only 3 of them. All right, so that's basically what I've written already in the overview here. There's something not true at the very bottom of that white thing. It says the first study in the program is starting in January 2023. It's actually starting in February. We had a whole bunch of supply chain issues with regard to various reagents that are needed for this study, such that rather than starting towards the end of January, as we had originally expected, when the mice would have been 18 months old, we're actually starting a month later when the mice are 19 months old. The official kickoff date when we will blow the whistle is February the 25th. So in other words, 8 days, 6 days from now. So yeah, it's an exciting time right now. We are really stoked about this, and that's what we're going to be doing. So I want to look now a bit more about the goals and motivations. And I've said quite a lot of this earlier, but I've put a few numbers to it. And I want to talk a little more about the, shall we call it the rhetorical motivation, because there are really just as strong reasons for for doing this study for persuasion reasons as there are for scientific reasons. So I'm going to go through both of those. Right, so first of all, looking at the top, you can see some numbers in those bullet points. So a historic mean lifespan of 30 months or more is fairly long for mouse strains. The standard strain that is used the most often in mouse lifespan studies is called C57 Black 6, and it lives about 31 months on average, depending on which lab you look at, that kind of amount. So that's the strain that we have used for this, using for this initial study. There is another strain called HET3, which has some advantages and which is used by some other groups, especially the interventions testing program at the NIA. And we might very well have used that strain instead, but we simply couldn't get enough of those mice that were already 18 months old. So we may very well switch to that strain for the second round of this program, but we're using Black 6 for this first round. And as I mentioned there, we're going to be starting at an age of at least 18 months, specifically 19 months. So we bought all these mice. They arrived just before New Year, because that's how you do this. Whenever you buy mice from another place, and we bought ours from Jackson Labs, you always want to give them a little while, typically a month, to acclimate to their new environment, or otherwise there's quite significant stresses involved. We are doing the experiment, I should probably point out at this point, at iCore Life Sciences, which is a company that was actually one of the spin-outs from Sense Research Foundation, one of the earlier ones, and it's by far the most successful one. It was originally spun out for the purpose of pursuing and commercializing our work on macular degeneration, and that's gone very well. But most of what they do now is as a CRO, a contract research organization, and they've done a whole bunch of mouse experiments in the past, mouse lifespan experiments included. One of the principal people there, Danik Wortel, is a qualified vet and has enormous experience in all of this, and she has trained a lot of staff. So we are in the absolute best possible hands in terms of the actual mechanics of getting this experiment done and done right. And we are absolutely delighted to be in that position. So let me now highlight briefly the third bullet point here, the effect size that we're looking for. And this is the definition that I gave to the term robust mouse rejuvenation, which is the name of the project. Most of you, I guess, will know the concept of longevity escape velocity, after which the foundation is named, which is all about postponing the rate of aging faster than time is passing. And that involves progressive improvements in the comprehensiveness of rejuvenation therapies that are made so as to be able to progressively more effectively rejuvenate people who are getting chronologically older. Because that concept of longevity escape velocity involves the rate of progress of science, it means that actually it's harder, considerably harder, to achieve longevity escape velocity for short-lived species than it is for long-lived species. So I think that we have at least a 50-50 chance of getting to longevity escape velocity for humans between, let's say, 12 or 15 years from now. But I think it's very touch and go whether we will ever get there for dogs or cats. And I'm 99% certain that we will never get there for mice. So I have instead defined this sort of poor man's version of longevity escape velocity for mice called robust mouse rejuvenation. And that's defined by those 12 months that I mentioned in the third bullet point here. And the key point here is that we extend both mean and maximum lifespan by at least 12 months. Now, another thing that is not written here, but which I want to highlight because it relates to a couple of studies that have received quite a lot of attention recently in the media and also in discussion within the community, is the idea that we start at an age of at least 18 months. Now, when I say at least 18 months, I actually mean about 18. In other words, I do not want to start such experiments when the mice are really going downhill and when they've got only an average of a couple of months to live. Because those mice, they're already sick. The ones that, so there are a couple of experiments that have been published recently where the experiment began when half of the original cohort was already dead. So the other ones had, they were 90% or more on average through their eventual total lifespan. And, if you extend the lifespan of those mice, then what are you actually doing? You're, at best, you are getting a small amount of rejuvenation. And at worst, you're just extending the sick span of these mice rather than the health span. So I believe that the merits of such experiments are limited compared to starting when the animals still have a certain amount of life in them and are not yet sick, not yet detectably sick anyway. So I believe that we should start when we expect the control mice to live about another year rather than expecting them to live only about another couple of months. And that's what we're doing. So, right. So as I mentioned, we're doing 4 different studies, and I'll talk, of course, individually about each of those shortly. But the key thing is that we're going to be doing a lot more than just measuring how long they live, as is very correctly done by many groups these days. We will be measuring a lot of aspects of the health of these mice. And we'll be doing that in a whole bunch of ways. Let me just see if I do. Here we are. So I've got this diagram here talking about that. So at the top, it's just describing what we're doing. We've got 4 different ways in which we measure the health of mice at various different ages. First of all, there are visual things. How do they look? That means things like, are they losing hair? Are they getting alopecia? That's a very nice, easily quantifiable aspect of aging in mice. Also kyphosis, which is the bending of the spine. That's something that you can quantify quite accurately, and it's something that happens during aging in mice. Then on the right-hand side, you can see how do they act? How old do they act? What I mean is, of course, their behavioral things. We have various tests of things like memory and grip strength. how strong they are. There's a number of studies of measures there which have been used by lots of different groups in the past. There are pretty standardized ways of going about them, so we'll be doing that. And then there are tissue samples. There are some things you can do that are not lethal to the mice. So just taking a small amount of blood, for example, and measuring things like levels of certain micronutrients. You can do glucose tolerance tests this way. We will be. And then finally, there's sacrificing mice and looking at their tissues. Now, of course, if you sacrifice a mouse, then you don't know how long it was going to live. So we will not be doing that to more mice than we need to. We'll be doing it to something like 1/4 of the total mice. And the other 3/4 will be the lifespan study. But of course, there's a great deal that you can get from studying tissues like that you just can't get if you want the mouse to survive the isolation. So we'll be doing all of that, and we'll be, of course, collating all of those results into an understanding of what effects the treatments had. But let me go back to the last paragraph of the black section, which is the question of why we're doing this. I already mentioned that there is a scientific reason and a rhetorical reason. The scientific reason, of course, is that things that work in mice, well, they don't necessarily work in humans, but they are more likely to work in humans than things that don't work in mice. So we definitely want to do that. And we actually are, I mean, you can think of this as perhaps a little bit over-optimistic. I don't think it is. I think it's a reasonable thing to say that damage repair treatments are more likely to translate to other species, such as, for example, humans in our case, than pharmacological treatments or dietary interventions that kind of, if you like, mess with metabolism, as I like to say. That may or may not be true, but it's just like my intuition that they're more likely to work. So that's one motivation. But the other motivation is really important, that to the extent that we succeed with this study, and certainly once we reach that threshold that I've defined, where we're extending the mean and maximum lifespan of these mice by a year, especially because we will be doing so by extending their healthy lifespan by a year, and we'll be able to demonstrate that, of course, by the health measures that we are quantifying. If we can do that, then it just becomes impossible for the naysayers and deathists out there to carry on saying, oh, you know, aging is not a disease and it's woven into the fabric of the universe and there's no way that medicine's ever going to be able to do anything about it. It's just not going to be possible to say that anymore. It will be laughable. And people like us who have been saying that that's wrong for a long time will be able to say it's wrong much more authoritatively than we've been able to do before. We'll be able to genuinely laugh in the face of people who try and say things like that. And that's what we need. We really need to be able to do that. All right, so let's go into a few more nitty-gritty details of the study. So as I mentioned, the study is going to be done at ICOR. They are a really fantastic group. I mean, I cannot speak too highly of what they've been doing. First of all, their capabilities. They are the best people to do this. But also, they have been demonstrating in spades their longevist credentials. They have done so much already, even in preparing to do the study, to make it possible, to maximize the amount that we can do, to cut costs for us and everything, so that we didn't have to cut corners too much on the design of the study. They have been heroic, no question. Mouse strain, I mentioned earlier that we're using Black 6 because that's the strain that's been normally used. By October or so of this year, we understand that Jackson Labs should be able to supply 18-month-old Het3 mice, and we may very well switch to that strain. Het3 is a 4-way cross that is generated by taking grandparents from 4 different inbred strains, one of which is Black 6, and combining them so that there is a restoration of what's called hybrid vigor and less tendency to die of things that have just become prominent in one particular inbred strain. And they do live a bit longer than black 6, and they genuinely are more heterogeneous. So that may very well be useful. All right. So as I said, the interventions are being chosen because they individually worked pretty well, and we are having control. I should say one more thing about the controls, which is mentioned here. And this is something that is made possible by the fact that the study is so big and that it's combinatorial. So when you do any kind of intervention in any kind of experimental animal, then you have what you believe to be the active ingredient of the intervention, and you have a delivery mechanism. And the delivery mechanism may itself have an impact on the mice, or it could be worms, it could be flies. And it would be very nice to know whether that's the case. So because this experiment is large, we are in a position to actually ask that question. For example, one of our interventions, I'll come back to it in a moment, is a gene therapy intervention. And the gene is the active ingredient, but the therapy is a viral vector. And the viral vector may itself have an impact on the mice. So we are having two types of control mouse. One of them gets the viral vector without the gene, and the other one doesn't get the viral vector at all. And for each of the 4 interventions, we have a corresponding split of the controls, one called sham, and the other one is what we call naive. The sham is the one that gets the delivery, but not the active ingredient, and the naive is the one that doesn't get the delivery either. All right, so let me now come to another of the important innovations that we have introduced here. In general, when you're doing this kind of health span analysis during a lifespan experiment, and this applies to the mice that we kill we sacrifice in order to do tissue analysis, and it also applies to the non-invasive measures that we do. Generally, when you do this, you pick particular chronological ages for your animals at which you measure things, and you say, well, okay, if the mouse behaves or seems by whatever measure it is to be biologically younger at a given age than the controls, then this tells you that the therapy is working, and that's all very wonderful. But the thing is, this is a lifespan experiment, which means that if the therapy is working, we expect the mice to live longer. And so, in a sense, what one is doing there is one is measuring two things that one already knows are going to be highly correlated. One being the health of a particular chronological age, and the other being the lifespan. In other words, the remaining lifespan at that chronological age. And that's inefficient in terms of, information acquired per dollar. So we're not doing that way. We are taking each of our groups individually, and we're saying, let's do our health span measures, both the non-invasive ones and the ones that involve sacrificing, at a particular point on the survival curve. So each of our groups has 50 mice. We've had 1,000 mice, 10 different treatment groups, but each of those treatment groups is half male, half female. So that means a total of 20 groups, really, each of 50. And what we do is we start out at 50, and then we wait until 10 of the mice have died. And that's when we do our first time point, when we do our measurements. Of course, we've also done a time point at T0 at baseline, which we only had to do once rather than doing it once per group, because all of the groups were the same at that point. They hadn't received any interventions or control. Anyway, so we get to wait until 10 mice have died, and then we kill 4 of them, and we do a whole bunch of experiments on the ones we don't kill. And then we wait until another 8 mice have died, and so on. So we have these various time points at which we do our thing, but they're not time points in chronological age. They're time points in terms of how far through the survival curve the group has got. And we believe that that's going to give us a lot more information in terms of just like improving the signal to noise ratio, shall we say, relative to other ways of doing things. And so I'm quite pleased to say that even though this seems to be a new idea, the people who have been commenting on it seem to have been commenting very positively. So I'm quite pleased with myself for coming up with that one. All right, so now let's talk about the individual therapies. And as I mentioned, we have 10 groups. We have a group that has controls and nothing else, controls for everything. We have a group number 10 that gets everything. We have 4 groups, each of which gets just one intervention, and we have 4 groups, each of which gets all but one intervention. So now it's time to talk about what the interventions actually are. First one is rapamycin, and some of you may be surprised that rapamycin is in there, because after all, rapamycin is not a damage repair intervention. It's something that definitely messes with metabolism, and most people believe that it works essentially as a calorie restriction mimetic. But still, the fact is, it works late in life. It's been known for a decade that if you give mice rapamycin, starting in the kind of age that we're starting, then both mean and maximum lifespan is increased. So you can think of this as a kind of non-repair control, if you like, or perhaps you can think of it as a control that is stimulating endogenous repair in certain ways. But either way, we feel that we want to know how this interfaces and interacts and dovetails with the genuine damage repair, direct damage repair approaches. And as you can see here, the interventions are divided in the way that I've already described. All right, the next one is a senolytic. So all of you know about senolytics, that they are drugs or interventions that remove senescent cells, and it seems that this is quite good for mice. Now, at the time that this page was last updated, we had not even chosen what the senolytic was going to be. But a little while ago, I mentioned, I think it was an interview with Lifespan.io, what it was going to be. It's going to be a chemical called navitoclax, which has been used as a senolytic in a number of experiments. Navitoclax is quite a good senolytic. It kills senescent cells. It doesn't kill most other cells. However, there's one particular type of cell that navitoclax does kill that we wish it would not, and that is platelets. And so it's quite toxic. But some time ago, a few years ago, a group in Spain figured out how to fix that. They realized that one could exploit the fact that senescent cells, by and large, express a very high level of a particular enzyme that breaks down a particular type of sugar called galactose. The enzyme is called beta-galactosidase. And they figured out that you could encase navitoclax in galactose in such a way that when it went into cells, it didn't do anything because it was hidden from its target, except in cells which would break down the galactose because they were making a lot of this enzyme. And then the navitoclax would be liberated and the cell would be killed. And there's now a way of doing that that doesn't exactly involve encasing the navitoclax. It involves instead making it into a prodrug, so covalently attaching a molecule of galactose in a place that inactivates the drug. And so that's what we're using. And that took a bit of work. We benefited greatly from some of our friends in Europe who were able to hook us up with the right kind of chemists who were able to make large amounts of this stuff. And so that's happening. It was a bit touch and go, and that's one of the reasons why we delayed the whole experiment by a month, is that it wasn't clear that we were going to be able to get this stuff in time, but that is nicely in progress. So I'm very happy about that. So the next thing is, I'm slightly pleased that Liz Parrish couldn't make it today, because it means that I can be even more effusive about Liz than I normally am, just without risk of just embarrassing her into too much. Because Liz is someone that all of you know I have a very high opinion of, but she has been so utterly heroic in helping us with this. She, as many of you know, published a paper quite recently with George Church showing the impact on mouse lifespan of the catalytic subunit of telomerase, TERT, supplied to mice relatively late in life. Very exciting result. Basically the same thing had been shown a few years ago by Maria Blasco, using a different modality, but essentially supplying the same thing. And in a sense, it's quite surprising that this is so beneficial, because mice do, after all, make their own telomerase in most of their cell types. But nevertheless, it works. And through the good offices of Liz Parrish, we have been able to get hold of viral MTERT that we will be supplying to our mice. And it was very, very difficult to do. And, without Liz, we wouldn't have got there. So, I am eternally grateful to Liz Parrish for the efforts that she made in helping us to make that happen. Finally, stem cell therapy. So there are various ways in which stem cell therapy has been hoped to benefit lifespan. And people have been mostly interested in mesenchymal stem cells. But we got interested over the past year, especially in hematopoietic stem cells, the blood stem cells, because a study came out a couple of years ago showing that, again, if you did a bone marrow transplant to middle-aged mice, you could extend their mean and maximum lifespan. And of course, this is a heterochronic stem cell transplant. In other words, you get your stem cells from the bone marrow of young mice. So this involves sacrificing a lot of young mice. But that's what we're doing. And it's probably the single most labor-intensive component of the entire study, but it's got to be done because the results have been, the result was very impressive. And of course, one thing about this study that's worth highlighting is that it is in some sense a contrast to what's been done with heterochronic parabiosis and such like over the past decade or so. That work, which originally started out as obviously actual parabiosis, surgical joining together of the circulatory systems of a young animal and an old animal, that has very much moved in the direction of exchanging plasma, just taking young plasma, putting it into old mice, or now just taking the plasma out of an old mouse and putting back essentially water with one protein in it. So that's one direction that things have gone. But this, of course, neglects the potential that the cells might have to be the active ingredient that makes young blood better for you, which I think definitely must not be neglected. And so that's another reason why we chose to do this. Right, so I'm nearly done, actually. I'll be able to shut up in a few minutes and start the conversation. But I've already mentioned a number of the things we're doing in terms of health span measurements. So rotor and grip strength for physiological function. And we're also looking at cognition, memory, visual acuity, things like that. We're also going to be taking blood samples for glucose tolerance testing and platelet counts and such like. And as I mentioned, we're also going to be sacrificing a bunch of mice and looking at a whole bunch of the organs in a lot of different ways. We're going to be both fixing and freezing organs so as to be able to do different kinds of interventions. So I've talked about these already. I'm just going to close by talking about the future. I mentioned that we chose these 4 interventions on the basis that they had already been shown by other groups to be capable of extending mean and maximum lifespan in mice that were perfectly normal and when the intervention was started late in life. And that's a pretty high bar. But there are plenty of other interventions out there that have come close to that in various ways, and that definitely appear to have, a lot of arguments for being tried out. So we are not short of things that we'd like to try. So this bottom section of the page, which I won't read out, but which you're welcome to look at later, gives our current thoughts, well, most of our current thoughts, on the ways in which we might go. One thing, well, there are a few things that I haven't mentioned here that we're definitely thinking about, including partial reprogramming, and also including specific therapies against cancer, which we think deserve to be looked at, even though apparently any therapy that extends maximum lifespan in a mouse, most of whom die of cancer, must postpone cancer by definition. And there are various other things that we may look at. But that's where we're at the moment. So yes, I think I will stop there, and I'll stop sharing my screen. And I am keen to start the conversation.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Aubrey, for that presentation. And we have a number of questions from the audience as well as the panel. Let us start with Dr. Jose Cordero.
Aubrey, fantastic to see you virtually once again and seeing all the wonderful things that you are doing.
Thank you.
I have a question again. When do you plan to publish, finish with this study and then publish and begin with the second phase of treatments, as you mentioned, epigenetic reprogramming and so on? That is number one. And number two, how about your interest in cryonics? What is the latest with Tanya Jones and Kai Nice, and also with Alexandra Stolzing, please?
All right. So let me just do the second question first because it's easier. Kai Nice is moving forward slowly but surely. Tanya is in the process of setting it up. That's complicated because she has to extricate herself from the remains of Aragos. But that's very much happening, and we are seed funding it at a very respectable level. Alex is actually going in a different direction now, and you'll have to ask her about what's going on in her world. But Tanya is definitely going to be doing great things very soon. Now, the other question, actually, I'm going to answer really three separate questions, all of which I want to answer individually. And these are actually things that I should have mentioned earlier. So thank you very much for asking them. First of all, in terms of publication, we absolutely anticipate that this study will lead to a whole bunch of publications. I would say at least half a dozen. But of course, one tends to have to get to the end of a study before one, or at least close to the end, before one can do that. And that won't do. We definitely want to make sure that the community and the world is well aware of how well the study is going. And we want to do that in what you might call real time. So the second answer to your question is how we are going to be publicizing as opposed to publishing the work. And the answer is that we're going to be publicizing it all the time. So that would have happened already if we had started the project at the end of January as we were originally planning. But what's actually going to happen is 6 days from now, when the project actually begins, I shall be absolutely putting out there an announcement that that's happened, and with an update on things that I did not mention at the time in earlier things, like, for example, the nature of the senolytic. And thereafter, we will be putting out information at least every month on what we're finding. The survival information, the actual, dates of death and ages at death of each animal in each group, I'm hoping to be able to put out actually more like once a week. So we will have constant updates of this. We, first of all, are thinking that that's the way to keep people's interest up and excitement and all that. But also, of course, we just believe that this is our duty, a public duty. We are funded by philanthropy, of course, and we have the luxury, because of that we don't have to worry about, priority, whether it's for publication or for patenting reasons or anything like that. We can just tell people whatever we know as soon as we know it, and that's what we're going to be doing. As for the final part of your question, the question about when the second phase is going to begin, we believe that we will be ready in terms of the design of round 2 to begin by October or so. We believe that we're going to be starting to, work in earnest on designing phase 2 in April and May. And so we believe that we're going to have made all the key decisions, or be able to have made all the key decisions by the end of May or so, which is basically what we need in order to get the thing going by October. However, I have to emphasize that that will not happen unless we receive a lot more funding. because these experiments, each round costs $3 million or so, and we've got less than half that right now for round two. So I am, vigorously beating the bushes right now, and we will see whether we actually get enough funding in the door in time to be able to get going at that point.
Yes, thank you, Aubrey, for those responses. And we have a number of audience questions now, so I will pose a few of them. Zach Richardson wonders, how would you go about testing grip strength for mice? And I can imagine mice with their tiny limbs. What would you be testing for?
Yeah, it's not actually very difficult. You can, there are videos online, they've published by other labs. This has been quite a standard test for quite a while. Essentially what you do is you just hold onto the tail of the mouse, whether with your hand, well, not with your hand normally, but with something that can measure tension, and you just pull the mouse back when you are, incentivizing the mouse to hold on to something by, for example, putting food in front of it or something like that. It's quite easy to incentivize a mouse to do something simple like that, and you just see how strongly you have to pull the mouse's tail before the mouse fails to hang on. That's all they do.
Quite interesting. Thank you. And Daniel Tweed wonders, are you using any AI for research decisions or aid?
We're not using any AI for research decisions. The decisions that we're making in terms of what experiments to do and how to design them are made overwhelmingly on the basis of many decades of development of expertise. If this is the same reason why people use mice and, to a lesser extent, rats and hardly any other mammal in experiments in biology, not just in gerontology. It's just because we know how. There's all these things that people have figured out over the decades for how to do these things, and that's by far the most important component of how to make decisions on design of an experiment. But other types of aid include the analysis of the results that we get, and of course some of that analysis will be omic. It'll be big data, and absolutely we will be liaising with our many friends who are experts in applying state-of-the-art machine learning to such data, so as to extract as much from it as possible.
Yes, thank you for that response. And one of our viewers, Matt Alex, mentioned the recent experiments by Harold Katcher on rat lifespan. There's an article in The Guardian about this, which I have linked. And essentially, one outcome of those experiments was that the oldest living lab rat named Seema was the result. This lab rat lived for 47 months and beat a prior record of 45.5 months. And we were discussing public perception and the importance of breakthroughs that essentially shift people's perspectives on what is feasible. What do you think about Harold Katcher's study and how that would contribute to the public perception, and how the robust mouse rejuvenation study would additionally contribute to public perception beyond what Harold Katcher's work has done already or might do in the coming months as the publicity from this reverberates?
Right. Yeah, I believe Seema is actually still alive. So the record may become even more extreme over the next week or two. You never know. The first thing I want to say about that experiment is to give a huge shout out to Didier Cornell, who is the co-founder of HEALS, the Healthy Life Extension Society in Europe, and who has over quite a few years put very substantial funds into experiments in this area, including he's the main funder of HEALS itself. He actually funded this work that we're talking about. So, massive kudos to him, because, to the extent that this does work out to be reproducible and, very significant, he played an enormous role in making it happen. Okay, so what is the chance that this is a real breakthrough? Well, of course, one has to give the usual caveats. First of all, it was a very small experiment. There were just 8 treated rats and 8 control rats. And you kind of never know what you're going to get if you, in terms of the variability. However, we can certainly say, even with that relatively small number, that the control rats lived unusually long for their strain, Sprague-Dawley. Many people say in the literature that Sprague-Dawley's average lifespan is about 30 or 31 months. My best information from more recent people who work with them is it's more like 36 months. But still, the control rats in Harold's experiment live for 38 months on average, which means that there's no way that anyone can say that the effect size that was observed was just because the controls being short-lived, which is a standard complaint that can be made about a lot of other rodent experiments. So then, the effect size was very substantial. And we have to ask, what's really going on? Is this because Harold and his colleagues have really found the fountain of youth in plasma? Honestly, I've got a lot of questions. The patent that Harold and his colleagues filed some time ago on their preparation is public. It's been public for a little while now, and I encourage everybody to look at it. So, it doesn't look as though they are, disclosing or, concealing or, misleading people. Nevertheless, it's extremely difficult to believe that they're doing exactly what they seem to say they're doing. Because what they're doing is they are injecting into rats purified extract from plasma taken from pigs. And, there's an immune problem here, a huge immune problem. You would expect like anaphylactic shock if you do anything like that. Now, this question has been brought up in various, exchanges on various blogs, especially Josh Mitteldorf's blog, where I'm pleased to say that Harold's colleague Akshay has been extremely forthcoming and friendly in answering everybody. And he says, yeah, it's true. The things that we are isolating are so extraordinarily well conserved across species that there isn't an immune reaction. But that's very hard to believe, very hard indeed. And so that's my main question right now about Harold's study.
Yes, thank you very much, Aubrey, for that response. And now we will go to some questions from the panel. Let's start with Dr. Bill Andrews.
But I do want to comment that I'm very impressed. I think this is the most exciting thing going on in the anti-aging field right now. And I want to reinforce 2 comments you made. One was how important it is that some research get done that investors don't want to invest in. And I'm glad you're doing those because they're important. I also want to second your comments that you made about that force of nature, Liz Parrish. I think she's doing a lot to contribute to the success of a lot of things going on in the anti-aging field. But bottom line, I'm can't wait to see the results, and I'm going to be watching this in anticipation of it like I would in any adventure or suspense movie. So congratulations.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. Coming from as distinguished a scientist as you, that makes me feel very proud. And, I do feel that this is something which takes, a lot of courage and a lot of, being in the right place at the right time to take on. Otherwise somebody else would have done it first. So yeah, I do think it's certainly the most exciting and invigorating experiment that I've ever led. And though I say it myself, I agree with you. I think it is the most exciting thing that anyone's doing right now.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Bill, for those good words, and Aubrey for your response. Now, who else on the panel would like to ask Aubrey a question? David Wood, please go ahead.
So I want to echo what I heard, that this is truly an exciting and inspiring experiment, very well explained. My question's about, assuming some of this works, assuming we do get some rejuvenation or life extension of mice, then the critics are going to say, as we predicted, well, this just works in mice, it won't work in animals. I liked the argument you gave, Aubrey, as to why these interventions are more likely to be transferable from mice to humans than, say, pharmaceutical or dietary interventions, but still there will be a question. So what have you thought about the next step? Are there going to be other animals of intermediate lifespan that are going to have the same treatments? Mm-hmm. And maybe also you could comment on, do you think it would be again Lev or ICOR that would do these experiments? Or might it be that the landscape will have been so electrified by the original results that other groups might say, hang on, we're going to contribute to this as well and help out here?
Well, so I certainly think that the next step, once we have substantial success in this kind of rejuvenation, will be to emulate it in species of intermediate lifespan, as well as, of course, to see whether people, early adopters, decide to go the same way, prior to regulatory approval, in very much the same way that, of course, Liz Parrish herself did with one of these therapies. And various people are doing with one of the others, namely rapamycin. But in terms of intermediate species, I believe that we're already in a pretty good place to have that happen without too much delay. In particular, we have already got quite a lot of enthusiasm in the community for trying to develop treatments that work in dogs, especially in the community, companion animals. So I want to particularly highlight Matt Kaberlein here, who has, of course, been engaging in a study feeding rapamycin to dogs for a little while now. Matt will be coming to Dublin to our next Longevity Summit on August the 17th through 20th, and I will be making very sure that he talks all about that. But Matt is by no means someone who wants to restrict himself to rapamycin for the rest of his career. So I think it's extremely likely that he will be interested in working to take forward combination therapies in dogs. And of course, he's just the archetype that I chose to mention. There are plenty of other people who may very well want to do the same. The difficulty, of course, is that an experiment that costs $3 million in mice costs even more if you want to do it in dogs. And there's only a certain extent to which that can be offset by the fact that there are people out there who will pay money to keep their dogs healthy, whereas there are not so many people who will pay money to keep their mice healthy. So we shall see whether financial limitations get in the way. But scientifically, I am 100% behind what you said.
One quick follow-up about MTERT, because you pointed out that it's not entirely clear how MTERT in mice has the results that it has, because there is already telomerase expressed in mice. And some of other experiments that Liz Parrish has led with similar treatments in human brains and possibly curing diseases there. Again, it seems unlikely that this is going to have an effect via actually extending telomeres. So are you confident you've got some sufficient ideas as to what mechanisms may be undoing the damage here?
Yeah, well, obviously, I would also be very keen to hear what Bill has to say to this, because this is very much his domain. But the best understanding I have in this space is actually from subsequent work done in the past few years, again by Maria Blaskow. So the the best way to explain why Maria was able to get substantial life extension using somatic gene therapy of TERT was simply that even though most mouse cell types express MTERT, not all of them do, and there were some cell types that were in some way critical. But there's a better explanation now, courtesy of Maria's more recent work, which is she looked closely at the rate of telomere loss per cell division in mice, in vivo. And it's crazy, crazy big. I mean, like, most telomeres are as fragile as you can imagine. And of course, it's well established that what matters in terms of the impact on cell senescence or on apoptosis of short telomeres is the length of the shortest telomere, not the average telomere length. So if you've got very fragile telomeres, then you're going to have, and they're on average, shortening rather rapidly. Even if they start long, you're going to get occasional ones here and there that shorten by a crazy amount, and you're going to need, you're going to need more than the amount of telomerase you're making to stop that from happening. So this kind of just about, it's still a bit hand wavy. I'm not going to say it's not, but it kind of doesn't look as crazy as it used to look. I'd love to know what Bill thinks.
Okay, well, definitely mouse telomere biology is different than humans, but there's clearly something going on. Maria Blasco's data, Liz Parrish's data, Rhonda Pino's data clearly say that something is happening. And I think a lot of the studies that come out of Maria Blasco's lab, and I agree with everything Aubrey just said, but especially the stuff about the fragile telomeres in the later lived mice. Okay, when they get older, they seem to start having a lot of what I call accelerated telomere shortening, and their telomerase expression plummets in a lot of the cell types, if not all the cell types. So I do think that mTERT is playing some role in mice. It just might not be playing the same role in humans, but I can't wait to see the data, just because I think there's going to be, we're going to definitely, this experiment that you're doing is good. People are going to learn something. Okay, and this is what's really exciting. So yeah, and we'll learn a lot about mTERT.
Thank you, Bill. And I didn't actually know that one thing you said there about telomerase expression plummeting late in life in mice. That could be a huge part of the answer.
Yes.
Very interesting. Now, along these lines, Alexandria Black, our Director of Community Resilience, has a question. She writes that Brett Weinstein discovered that lab mice have longer telomeres. How might that skew the experimental data, if at all?
Yeah, Brett Weinstein was definitely not the person who discovered that mice have longer telomeres. But of course, it is a question. Some wild strains, and indeed some lab strains, have considerably shorter telomeres than your typical strains. And people like Carol Greider have studied those strains in some detail to see whether there are any qualitative differences or any dramatic differences. There really aren't. It seems like the average telomere length and the fragility of telomeres have kind of co-evolved over time in the lab, in particular inbred strains and such that there's still a problem.
Yes, thank you for that response. And earlier, you gave some recognition to Didier Kernel, and he is in the chat now. He writes, we need 100 organizations like the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation and 100 people like Aubrey de Grey, hopefully to scale these efforts. But he also writes that the mother of his partner lived 96 years and died 2 days ago, and his father of 90 passed away today. 2 more people for whom the progress of research for a much longer, healthy life will come too late. And he then writes, despite all the hard work of caregivers and the progress and the lives of the elderly, the end of the aging journey is something that he would not wish on his worst enemy. So clearly, aging and the ravages of it continue to afflict people, and pretty much at the same pace as has been the case for decades prior. And I think this is a good bridge into a question from Taurus Londoño, who
before you ask it, let me just say, Didier is very kind to say that I give value and that we could do with 100 more of me, but I would absolutely want to say that we are absolutely in every bit as much need of 100 more Didiers. There are far too few people out there willing to dedicate their time and their financial resources to the defeat of aging. And Didiers, we definitely need 100 more Didiers.
Yes, indeed.
Wait a second, please. I have to take a moment.
We have a question from Torres Londoño, to the extent that any particular combination is effective for achieving robust mouse rejuvenation, what is the prospect of the same being available for humans and private clinics soon, especially given that we do have a situation where a lot of people are aging and suffering, as Didier has pointed out?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we've already got some of these things being available for humans in private clinics in certain countries. It's been, what is it now, 8 years since this parish became patient zero in relation to telomerase and follistatin. And we have quite a few other examples of this kind of thing. Of course, in the case of stem cells, especially mesenchymal stem cells, there are clinics in a number of countries offering treatments. Whether those treatments or how effective those treatments are remains to be seen. But as treatments become more effective, that will become, of course, more popular. So it's really just a case of what the I'm going to say the market can offer. You know, to the extent that there are people out there with who are willing and able to pay for such therapies, including combination therapies, people will come along and make those therapies available.
Yes, thank you, Aubrey. And now we have a question from Dan Elton.
Yeah, hi, Aubrey. Thanks for coming to do this event. I saw there's another project listed on your website, which is that you're funding work on a new form of cryopreservation for organs. So I was wondering if you could tell us about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a little bit.
Well, yeah, and then also like which organs would it work for, and which organs do you see the most promise in growing right now for specifically for rejuvenation?
Right. So there's a certain amount of updating I need to do on that, on the website on that. But to in a nutshell, this is a company named Keinice, Keinice, which probably doesn't even have a website yet, which is led by my great friend Tanya Jones. Tanya was the chief operating officer at Sense Research Foundation for some years. Before that, she worked at Alcor for many years. And between Sense Research Foundation and now, she led a company named Aragos. And Aragos was focused on developing a new method for cryopreservation of solid organs called persiflation, which involves pumping gas through the vasculature. And the idea here is because the vasculature goes everywhere within an organ, you can cool an organ much more rapidly that way than if you do it just from the outside. And there are other advantages in terms of fracturing that are also arising from pumping gas through the vasculature. The big innovation that Aragos brought in was that the gas in question would be helium. This has various advantages, especially that it has very low solubility in water, which means that you don't get problems arising from that. But there's still a long way to go to make it work really well. However, the benefits relative to cryopreservation of solid organs that we have today will be like astronomical, because the fold rate of cooling that is achieved is at least a factor of 10, probably more. And that means that you can use very much lower concentrations of cryoprotectant. I'm sure you know that cryoprotectants that are used in cryopreservation in cryonics are designed to prevent crystallization when the organ becomes a solid, so that the organ becomes vitrified into a glass. And it turns out that the concentration of cryoprotectant that you need to use for that purpose is inversely related to the rate at which you cool. The faster you cool, the less cryoprotectant you can get away with. You can get away with less cryoprotectant and therefore less toxicity. Not least because you have less time for the toxicity to actually happen before the organ becomes so cold that chemistry ceases. So Keinice is a kind of revival of Aragos. Aragos ran out of money but we are very happy to say in a position to seed fund its reboot. And I'm very sure there will be a lot more to hear about that quite soon.
Excellent. Thank you, Aubrey. And then we can open this up to anyone from the panel. Dr. Edward Hudgens, please go ahead.
Before we do that, David had a follow-up question to Dan's, which I think I should probably answer. David's asking, why should Kinice have any difficulty finding money commercially? And honestly, the answer is it's still too early. There's still too much proof of concept to do. I certainly do not expect that Kinice will need funding from philanthropic sources for long, but in the near term, over the coming year, shall we say, there is just some essential proof of concept to do, which will be required before people who actually want to make money and therefore who want to invest will be interested.
All right. Thank you for that. And let us go to Edward Hudgens now.
Yeah, thanks. Excellent presentation. I'm especially impressed by the model of the experiment. Very, very thorough. And I think that's going to be very useful to your point about promoting it and basically saying, look, this is a very thorough approach and so forth, your point about rhetoric. And I think that education is going to be terribly important. As you know, I've been working on FDA reform and sort of other associated reforms when I put into a piece of legislation last year that it would cover the processes that constitute aging. That was considered too controversial, by members of Congress who are on average, 70 or 75 years old. So no sense of survival, I'm afraid, there. But I think we have an opportunity as we go ahead this year and this next 2 years. There are a lot of reforms being talked about for the Food and Drug Administration, for Medicare, and the like, some of them bipartisan. I know that we have the best choice medicine approach that Bill there and Liz are promoting, and some of the others. I think it's an opportunity over time, especially with what's coming out of your work, to raise the level of understanding among influencers, policymakers, and the like. Because again, when I talk to a lot of them, their eyes kind of glaze over things that we consider common sense here. Just it doesn't sink in. But I think we have an opportunity, especially in the next 2 years, and especially with some of the work you're doing, and hopefully some of the others, in the longevity movement are doing, to really raise the level of consciousness and hopefully funding. I'm going to be reaching out. I don't know if you've had any association with Apple Computer, or Apple, I should say, but one of their big things in the future is they want to make Apple watches and such. They want to make themselves into a healthcare company. And it seems that this is the kind of thing that they might want to put some money in, that, because they put hundreds of millions of dollars into basic research on things that don't, pop up in our devices, until 3, 4, 5 years down the line. So it seems like that might be an opportunity for you.
Well, sure. I don't think there was a question there, but everything you say makes sense.
Great opportunities you're presenting for most of us here.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So thank you, Edward, for those remarks. And now I would like to go to some of the panelists who haven't had a chance to ask questions yet. Let's go to Arin Vahanian, our vice chairman.
Thanks, Gennady. And firstly, I'd like to offer my condolences to DDA. That's an absolutely massive losses in the last couple of days. And it just demonstrates how important this work is. And Aubrey, maybe a business question, if I may. I think you're not too fond of these, but I think we should discuss this as well. So in addition to the obvious sort of assistance we can offer from the business world, which is, of course, funding, what are maybe some other ways that people in the business community, now whether they're in the transhumanist party, in the transhumanism community, or biotech community, or any other community, what other sorts of assistance could people in the business community offer the LEV Foundation and other such foundations and early stage biotech startups in addition to funding?
Yeah, so I think the single most important answer to that question actually does not revolve around foundations like LEV Foundation, but rather around science and technology that is being developed within academia, or, well, sometimes individually, but by people who do not have entrepreneurial skills or track record. There's an awful lot of that. An awful lot of people out there who couldn't run a business to save their lives, and they think, you know what, I've got this technology. I see that some people make money by going out and getting investment. Maybe I'll start a company and try and get investment. And they start their company and they talk to investors, and the investors immediately see that they don't have the faintest idea how to run a company. And so they don't write the check. Whereas if that professor or whatever has been able to partner with someone who does have entrepreneurial skills and perhaps credentials, and can talk the right language, then the whole thing becomes an altogether more attractive value proposition. Now, over the years, I have on various occasions been able to make that happen, just introduce the right people to the right people. And, I'm very pleased with that, but it doesn't scale when it's just me doing it. So about 18 months ago, I started a process that led to a rather splendid new thing called Less Death, which was a retreat that happened last summer and happened again this past January, and will be happening 3 more times this year, and so on. And essentially, the purpose of this retreat is to bring people together who want to make a difference to the longevity movement and who have various skills, but who do not know how to apply those skills to have an impact. And the reason they don't know how may be largely because of what they don't know and also because of who they don't know. So the purpose of these retreats is to fill in the gaps. So perhaps someone's only got a very superficial knowledge of biology, for example. They need to understand what aging is and so on a little bit better. Maybe they are already biologically sophisticated, but there are other things they don't know. And in particular, they don't have the connections. They don't have people they can meet who they might be able to partner with. This applies beyond the entrepreneurial issue. It applies to a whole bunch of things. This is very cool that Mark Hammerleinen, who runs Less Death, actually talked about this apparently last June. So I regard that as a really major initiative. I'm very happy that even though I was very much between jobs at the time, I was able to get Less Death going. And I'm delighted to say that it's done so well that they don't need LEV Foundation's money anymore. They are being very successful in bringing in the funding they need to run these things. So yes, I encourage everyone to get in touch with them and to see what one can do. Of course, there is at the retreat not only the people who are coming in as newcomers to the field, there's also typically a dozen or more of the veterans who are giving tutorials and workshops and so on to coordinate the whole thing.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Aubrey, for that response. And now let's go to Art Ramon Garcia for his question.
Yes, I had a question about mitochondrial transplants. I know it's been done in humans to sort of repair defective mitochondria. Has it ever been done, let's say, with a longer-lived species into a not as long-lived species, let's say like a Canadian beaver into a mouse in vitro? Like just do a transplant of mitochondria. Would that have an effect?
All right, so I'll answer your question directly, and then I'll answer what the question should have been. You can't do interspecies mitochondrial transfer. It just won't work. And the reason it won't work is because mitochondria have their own DNA, which makes their own proteins, but it doesn't make all their own proteins. It only makes 13 of them. The mitochondria have 1,000 or more other proteins that are encoded in the regular chromosomes in our nucleus and are imported into the mitochondrion after being synthesized in the body of the cell. Which means that if you put mitochondria from one species into cells of another species, whether in vitro or in vivo, then they end up having bits that don't fit together, to put it brutally simply. Literally physically fit together. The 13 proteins that are encoded in the mitochondrial DNA are subunits of multi-protein complexes that have other subunits that are encoded in the nuclear DNA, and they just won't fit right because there's been too much divergence of evolution between the different species. However, if we forget about interspecies transplantation, and we look at transplantation within a species from one animal to another, and even if we forget about the issue of age of the donor versus recipient, because that may actually not matter nearly so much as it does for the blood, then there's another problem, which is that when you inject these things, they don't go into the cells. They go into the space between cells. And they have to get into the cells in order to be useful, or at least in order to be useful for very long. They may have a very near term, for a week or two, at most, probably less than that, a day or two, benefit just by the energy they contain, the other things they contain. But in order for them to have long-term value, they have to get into the cells. And they have to get into the cells in a manner that allows them to interact with the machinery, that allows them to, divide and do stuff. And that basically is something that has largely been ignored by most of the groups that are working on this. I'm pleased to say that one group that's working on this, a company called Mitrix, M-I-T-R-I-X, has recognized, I have to say somewhat with my help, that this is an important thing to do. And so they have developed a rather nice method to essentially make sure that the mitochondria do get into cells in the right way. Essentially, it involves packaging them in advance in a particular way. And at Sense Research Foundation, there's a bit of interest in doing this as well. In order to have really long-term benefit, one needs to go one step further than that and to address the problem of mitochondrial mutations, which, of course, is a very long-standing interest of mine. And at Sense Research Foundation, there's a project looking at that as well, involving a concept called gene drive. But that would take too long for me to go into the details of.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you, Aubrey. And now let's see if John Carrots has a question.
Well, I don't necessarily have a question as much as a statement. I like the fact looking at it as the rejuvenating or the repairing method for longevity. I like that myself since I'm a recovering stroke patient myself, and I think that's a good way to go. There's a lot of things that you need that might get injured as you get older or get in disrepair that be good to be repaired, that would add to your longevity, and not only your longevity, but also your quality of life. And I think to some extent that's a good thing. And that's probably hard to tell. I hate to say it's hard to tell from working on mice, but yet if mice are doing better and eventually you get people to be doing better, I mean, then you can know what's going on. So I think that's a great way to look at it and to approach the longevity issue.
Well, thank you.
Yes, thank you, John. And now we will move on to some audience questions. Jed Lai writes that from his experience, the medical industry is under relatively strong pressure to out-engineer animal models for a number of reasons, not least the low crossover to human biology and the failure to translate. A significant strategic idea to mitigate this is to conduct suitable intelligence into which pathways or systems approaches have good translation and which do not before embarking on experimental treatments. And he wonders, can you demonstrate that this risk assessment will be taking place or has taken place?
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is completely correct. The low translatability, the low hit rate of translation from mice to humans is a big is something that we'd really like to address somehow as an industry. And of course, this applies, as Jed says, to the whole medical industry, not just to the work on aging. So first of all, of course, if I'm right that damage repair therapies are more translatable than pharmaceuticals, then that's good, but it's not by any means the whole answer. And therefore, it's very valuable that there's so much work going on right now to try to do things that are kind of an attempt to do an end run around this problem by developing things that are human in origin, but are not actual humans, actual living humans. So one huge area in this regard is, of course, organs on a chip. the attempt to develop versions of microorgans that are made from human cells and therefore behave in some ways like as the way one would expect humans themselves to behave, but which are nevertheless more manipulable in such ways. And organoids in general, very small versions of regular organs that people have increasingly figured out how to build. Now, I do not expect that such approaches will completely eliminate the need for testing on living animals, laboratory animals, because by their nature, these systems are looking at organs in isolation. And in the body, organs do not exist in isolation. They talk to each other through the bloodstream and in other ways. And if one does not model that aspect, then one is going to miss things. So I believe it's going to be a case of getting some information from one of those types of source and some from another.
Yes, thank you, Aubrey. And Jed has another question. He writes, Aubrey, you mentioned omics. I see epigenetics are being quantified. Will you be measuring accumulation of somatic cell mutation too? And he writes, I guess it's trivial if you're sequencing for methylation anyway.
Well, not particularly trivial. So the thing about methylation is you can do it on bulk tissue. You can get the average methylation state at a particular locus across, 1,000 or 100,000 cells. Whereas somatic mutations, except in the case of actual tumors, are, of course, different ones in different cells. And so it's a very different type of analysis, much more laborious. And to be honest, it's beyond our financial means, at least at the moment. But for sure, we will be measuring epigenetic age by, we haven't precisely made a decision on how we're going to do that. It's not something we need to decide yet because we'll be preserving tissue. And certainly that will be part of what we're doing.
Yes, thank you, Aubrey, for that response. Our viewer, Ampero, writes that he is dismayed by the lack of positive publicity for longevity in the major media. For instance, recently, Brian Johnson, the entrepreneur who has essentially invested $2 million of his own money into rejuvenating himself, or at least attempting to, and he looks pretty good and healthy for a 45-year-old, but he was mocked on The View, which is a common talk show program. I don't think highly of it at all for his personal longevity efforts. So this is a question with regard to public perception, and it seems that someone like Brian Johnson, even though he has convincingly done something to really improve his health, he is still getting this negative reception. How do you think a successful, robust mouse rejuvenation study would change that discourse?
Yeah, I guess anyone who works in anything pioneering is in danger of being mocked by people who are who can't really see the point. I mean, obviously, the study that we're doing is just one brick in the wall of this, battle for hearts and minds in relation to the question we're working on, the longevity crusade. The fact is, I guess I've always felt fairly philosophical about it, simply because I've taken into account from the beginning the fact that what we are taking on here is the challenge of dismantling millennia of coping strategies, of ability of techniques that people have developed over all those millennia to put aging out of their minds, and to trick themselves into really believing that it's some kind of blessing in disguise. So millennia of coping strategies is not a trivial thing to dismantle. And at some level, I feel fairly happy that we've got as far as we have got over the time that I've been involved in the field. But of course, there's still a long way to go. And this study is just one little bit of it.
Yes, indeed. And I think we all need to contribute in our own ways to shifting that public perception. Now, Taurus Londoño also wonders, I know you're hesitant to guess, Aubrey, but can you say which of the treatments in phase 1 of the robust mouse rejuvenation studies is the most promising, or that you hypothesize is the most promising?
Absolutely no idea. I mean, if you look at the published results on each of them in terms of the effect size, there's not a lot of difference. And in terms of which of them would combine most synergistically, it's complete guesswork. There's absolutely nothing we can do to say which of them might work better or worse. If there were, we would be doing a different experiment, to be perfectly honest. We want
Fair enough.
The whole point of any experimental design, however complex it is to try to distinguish between two or more hypotheses, each of which you think has some chance of being correct, right? And so, I mean, you don't do an experiment if you've got two hypotheses and you're already almost certain which of the two is correct.
Yes, that is reasonable. Now, David Wood supplements the discussion about Brian Johnson by pointing out that his treatment plan is led by Oliver Zollman, a 29-year-old regenerative medicine physician who received his medical degree from King's College in London. And David remembers seeing Oliver Zollman giving a talk at a longevity event in London or maybe Oxford sometime last year or so. And Martin O'Day also writes that he spoke in Dublin.
Yeah, Martin beat me to it. I was about to say that.
Okay. Very good. And it's interesting, too, that we have entrepreneurs, people of means, getting involved in the rejuvenation field. They're certainly capable of making a difference. And this is where Didier's next question comes in. He writes it's at least a $10 billion question. How to convince companies like Hevolution, Calico Labs, Altos Labs, and or the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation to do the same kinds of experiments as the LEVF? Or do you think that's even feasible, that they would venture in those directions?
Well, there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't. Actually, there's a story I like to tell about Calico in this regard. Before Calico existed, I'm going to say probably around 2010, I was doing a kind of panel discussion with Cynthia Kenyon. And at some point, in response to a question from the audience, Cynthia said that her sincere belief was that if a mouse genetic screen could be done that was as thorough and comprehensive as the kind of screens that could be done in nematodes, that, of course, she did herself to double the lifespan of nematodes in 1993, then the result would be a similar proportional increase, like a doubling of lifespan in mice. And I said to her at the time, well, you're the best person to write that grant application. And everyone laughed because everyone knew that the money involved would be beyond the means of any grant that anyone's likely to receive. But then she got a job at Calico, at which point this ceased to be a constraint. And a couple of years after that, I bumped into her and I reminded her of this conversation and said, you know what, now's your time. And she said, yeah, we should just do it, shouldn't we? But as far as I know, she hasn't. So you have to ask, how sincerely are these people into what they say they're doing? I mean, I'm not talking about Cynthia here. I'm talking about the people who actually make the funding decisions. And honestly, it's hard to know. Altos is, a fine company. It's doing, well, it looks as though it's going to be doing very important stuff. It's like remarkable that it took Jeff Bezos so long to get around to doing Altos Labs, given that he first started talking to me about aging and doing something about it at TED in 2006 and several times thereafter. Mark Zuckerberg's never talked to me at all. So, different people have very different motivations, different people that they think they need to keep happy. Everybody's different. And I honestly, if I had the answer to Didier's question, then, I wouldn't need to be out there beating the bushes all the time. I would have implemented that answer by now.
Very interesting. Well, let's hope that some of them at least will come around to supporting at least a fraction of the research that we need to get to longevity escape velocity. David Wood wonders, is there any reason to believe that any of the 4 treatments within the robust mouse rejuvenation study might reduce the damage to the extracellular matrix?
So this is an absolutely excellent question. So many of you may know that damage to the extracellular matrix was a bit of an orphan in 2013. That even though it was very much part of my 7 deadly things since 2000 or so, the authors of the Hallmarks paper just overlooked it. And that was my first reaction when I wrote to them all afterwards, congratulating them on having done this. I said, but you did kind of like not as such mention glycation at all. And they were a bit ashamed. But point is that I don't know. At this point, certainly we can say that none of these treatments will at least obviously have a direct effect on the extracellular matrix, causing increased turnover or whatever. But David very carefully uses the word reduce as opposed to repair. In other words, he includes the possibility that we might simply slow down subsequent damage to the extracellular matrix. And that certainly is possible because, of course, this damage is as a result of dysregulation of especially sugar in the circulation, which may very well be affected by all manner of metabolic improvements caused by, for example, having younger stem cells or having more regenerative stem cells as a result of telomerase or having fewer senolytic, having fewer senescent cells around. So yes, I could totally believe that we might slow down the accumulation of ECM damage. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you, Aubrey, for that response. And now let us go to Dan Elton, who has a question.
Yeah. Another initiative which has been funded recently, again, also by a private donor, is the Astera Institute. And they have a number of different scientific initiatives which they say are organized as focused research organizations. The one that's relevant here is the Rejuvenome. And it appears the Rejuvenome project is very similar to, in the sense that they're testing a number of interventions on mice. And so I was wondering if first of all, you are familiar with the Rejuvenome project, and then also, how does it compare to your research project, and what sort of things do you think? How would you compare and contrast the 2 initiatives?
Yes. Okay. So yes, I am quite familiar with the Rejuvenome initiative, and unfortunately, I have some bad news about it. So yes, the idea was that there would be a large mouse study that would definitely include late onset combination therapies. It did not have the feature that we have of going beyond the diet and using things that needed to be injected. So in that sense, it was a little bit less courageous than ours, but nevertheless, very valuable study. It was to be done at the Buck Institute under the supervision of a very senior and knowledgeable professor named Simon Meloff. And, I was very happy about it. It was funded, as you say, by the Astera Institute, which itself is funded, I believe, exclusively by an extremely wealthy crypto guy named Jed McCaleb, who made all his money with Ripple and who got extremely lucky in relation to that because he left Ripple and was... and there was an agreement to sell everything he had, and he sold it for US dollars, so I gather, and got finished doing so just as basically every cryptocurrency crashed. So he is, as far as I understand it, far more in possession of his peak wealth in terms of actual fiat currency than pretty much anybody else in crypto. And yes, he got interested in our mission, and he decided to put, so it is said, $70 million, 70, into the Rejuvenome project. paid at roughly $10 million a year. And so everything looked as though it was going fine, right up until he decided that the Buck Institute were being too greedy in terms of indirects, and he pulled out a few months ago. So basically they got their first 10 million, but that's all, as I understand it. This is all somewhat secondhand, so don't quote me on all of this any more than, well, don't necessarily believe that everything I'm saying is gospel truth. Nevertheless, yes, the project is, well, they like to say euphemistically that it's on pause pending the acquisition of further funding, but I'll be extremely surprised if they get their further funding. So I'm afraid that's the end of Rejuvenation.
But do you think they might be able to do something with that $10 million, or is it just sort of on hold right now?
Honestly, I don't even know whether that's already been spent.
Okay, because I had heard that they had started but yeah. So I'm sorry to hear of this this setback. But thanks for updating us on that.
Yes. Well, thank you, Aubrey, for that response. And we have about 3.5 minutes left in our salon. I would like to give you the chance to offer some closing remarks. And perhaps in those remarks, if you could offer any sort of forward-looking information with regard to the future of the robust mouse rejuvenation studies. One of our viewers, John McPherson, would like to know how many other studies are ultimately planned within the robust mouse rejuvenation sequence. Of course, that depends on funding, but what is your vision for this, and what can people look forward to if adequate funding is secured?
Yeah, I mean, my take on this is that we'll go on for as long as we need to. These are obviously experiments, so we don't know how successful they're going to be. But the goal is to achieve the actual numerical threshold of robust mouse rejuvenation that I set out earlier. And furthermore, to be honest, even if we get there, probably to keep going, because the further we get, the more persuasive the result is going to be as a way of getting people to really understand that that aging is malleable by medicine. So, yeah, I mean, I don't really necessarily see an end to it. It will not by any means be the only thing that LEV Foundation does. We definitely have a few ideas for areas of research that we'd like to get more done in, that would be a bit more like Sense Research Foundation projects. In other words, there would be ongoing early stage things that would eventually lead to potential spin-outs. But that's for the future. We haven't thought that through yet.
All right. Well, thank you for your response, Aubrey. And as Edward Hudgens points out in our chat, this can get the attention of policymakers if it succeeds. And of course, a big component of this is the public perception aspect as regards the feasibility of reaching longevity, escape velocity for humans, and rejuvenating human beings. So one last question for you, Aubrey, before we go. Is there a specific age for an individual mouse of the strain that LEV Foundation is using that would be a record-setting age that you're aware of?
Whoa. I think the key thing to recognize here is that we're not looking just for a world record for a single mouse. We're looking for things that scientists will pay attention to, which means that the mean lifespan, and when we talk about the maximum lifespan, the way that scientists tend to define this, tend to define this is the average lifespan of the last 10% of the mice. So if we've got maybe 40 mice in a particular treatment group, for example, the average of the last 4. So there, we think in terms of getting something that has scientific meaning, and therefore, in order to understand what record we would be beating, we have to go back to the published literature and ask, what was achieved in the past. But certainly, if we were to get anything like what I've defined robust mouse rejuvenation to be, then we would be way past anything that's been done before. way back in the Methuselah Foundation days, we created something called the Rejuvenation Mouse Prize, which was defined very much in the same kind of way. And the idea was to beat the existing world record. So of course we had to identify what the existing world record was. And in, I think, 2001 or so, 2003 maybe, Steve Spindler's group had used calorie restriction, done really carefully, starting late in life, starting I think 18 or 19 months, and they had extended the mean lifespan of those mice by 4 months. So that's 1/3 of what we want to do, right? So yeah, we'll be way, way past what's been done.
Yes, and let us hope that those ambitious results will be achieved. And thank you, Aubrey, for joining us today. I would like to echo Daniel Tweed's remarks. We are fortunate that Aubrey and all of us are on the long side of history, or in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, the long arc of progress bends toward what we seek to achieve, indefinite longevity and indefinite good health. So thank you to all of our viewers. Thank you to our panelists and to Aubrey for a great presentation. I hope that we all live long and prosper.
Live